Let us begin with this segment with the war in Ukraine. Denazification, demilitarization was the reasons given by the Russian state to go inside Ukraine and start a war. It said that it would like to eliminate any threats that it poses to its own security and existence of the Russian state. Do you think that these reasons had any legitimacy?
Yes, completely. That doesn't justify the war, which under post-Nuremberg laws is a criminal war of aggression, which all preemptive war is. But I think it's fair to say that Russia was baited into the war, going all the way back to 1989. I was in Eastern Europe in 1989. I covered the revolutions in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. I was there when the promises were made to Gorbachev by Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister, Margaret Thatcher, James Baker, who was then the US Secretary of State, that NATO would not be expanded beyond the borders of a unified Germany. Indeed, NATO was rendered obsolete. NATO, founded in 1949, was designed to prevent Soviet expansion into Central and Eastern Europe. Gorbachev not only did not pose a threat, or the new Russian Federation did not pose a threat in the wake of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, but Gorbachev, like Yeltsin, and people forget, like Putin in the early years, wanted to build a security alliance with Europe and the West. But of course, you had powerful forces. I would cite two. One, the weapons industry, which saw in the expansion of NATO billions in profits, which came to pass. And you also saw the arrogance and the hubris of Washington, which at the end of the Cold War began to speak about what they called a unipolar world. And by that, it meant total US domination, total US hegemony. They saw correctly that the Russian state was battered, weak, not a threat to its neighbors, much less to the United States. And it felt that it could do anything it wanted, including expanding NATO up to Russia's borders. So I think it were those two forces. There were frequent protests by Moscow, and as coupled with frequent breaking of promises by Washington. The Clinton administration, for instance, promised not to station NATO troops in the new NATO countries. And we now, I think, have upwards of 100,000. There's a missile base, NATO missile base, now 100 miles from the Russian border. And then we have to talk about Ukraine. So Ukraine, which Barack Obama said, recognized as within Russia's sphere of influence. The U.S. meddled in the 2014, let's call it a coup or overthrow, a government that had good relations with Moscow. And then that triggered a kind of civil war. I think there were 14,000 casualties. Remember, much of that eastern part of Ukraine is ethnically Russian. And then Ukraine became a kind of de facto NATO country. 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers were trained by NATO. There were American advisors, British advisors. They were sending weapons. So all of these were clear provocations that Russia had warned against. And we know, for instance, from the WikiLeaks diplomatic cables that were released, fully understood by Russian experts, including the now head of the CIA, who was then the ambassador to Moscow, Burns, who said that meddling in Ukraine would have provoke Russia across the political spectrum. Nobody saw this as, or it was interpreted across the political spectrum in Russia as a threat, would be perceived as a threat. So the forces that pushed Putin to invasion, and again, I am not in any way endorsing or defending. To understand is not to condone. There's no support for the invasion of Ukraine, but it was totally predictable. In fact, I wrote a column at the inception of the invasion called Chronicle of a War Foretold. So you had Sovietologists like George Kennan called the expansion of NATO the greatest blunder of post-Cold War history. You've had figures like Henry Kissinger, not a figure I have much admiration for, but he certainly understood or understands the danger and has called for swift negotiations and end to arms shipments. And even the New York Times, which has been very pro-war, wrote an editorial a couple months ago, said this idea of allowing Kiev to reconquer territory was folly, that there would have to be a kind of land for peace deal. But as long as billions and arms shipments continue to pour into Ukraine, you're not going to see a cessation of the war. And of course, this has made the arms manufacturers staggering profits. You also have internal forces in Ukraine. I don't think the neo-Nazi element's very large. It's hard to estimate, let's say 10%, but they have militias, armed militias, the Azov Battalion, etc. And remember, Zelensky ran as a peace candidate. He announced that he spoke Russian and he would rebuild relations with Moscow, etc. And from all I can read is that these kind of proto-fascist, neo-Nazi forces made it very clear to Zelensky that if he wanted to remain in power and perhaps remain alive, he better change his attitude towards Moscow, which he did. So these are all the forces that led to the tragedy. It's of course the people who are suffering the most are the Ukrainians. They are essentially pawns in this power play, because the reason Washington is providing the billions in weaponry and support has very little to do with Ukraine, and has to do with degrading Russia's military capabilities. Who's going to piece Ukraine back together? Well, you can look at past conflicts going all the way back to the war in El Salvador, which I covered, but Afghanistan, Iraq, anywhere else. So it's Ukrainian blood and it's Ukrainian devastation. And I think we have to be fair to the poor families of the Russian conscripts. So it's a very, very cynical move and very dangerous, as Kissinger and others have pointed out, to corner and humiliate Putin, although that's not gone particularly well, because we're dealing with a very significant nuclear power.
I talked to Noam Chomsky over the summers, and he said the same thing as you did, that there was plenty of provocation but no justification. I've talked to others on the left, for example, Paul Jay and even Daniel Ellsberg, and they stated that to provide a counter argument that the NATO presence did not threaten Russian existence, because NATO is also present in Latvia, which is very close to Russia, shares a border. We see that in Scandinavian countries, and NATO is also present in Poland. So if that didn't pose a threat to the Russian state and didn't give them, Ukraine didn't give NATO a strategic advantage, there was no justification or legitimacy to the war. So how do you counter this argument? Because we also see this in mainstream media being made. And how do you see that as somebody who's been covering this issue for such a long time?